ESG is a window into a company's future. ESG reporting and metrics are an important indicator of a company's overall health and can lay the foundation for a compelling story about the company's impact on the world. ESG isn't about checking a box. It's about running a responsible business for the long term. Your business needs a bridge to action. Part of a business's success is how well it prepares for and adapts to tomorrow's realities. It's how you'll run a resilient business while creating a better world. Use proven tactics and smarter technologies to identify, measure, and hold your business accountable to ESG principles using reliable data you can trust. Take a proactive approach to telling your story to employees, customers, shareholders, suppliers, and other stakeholders. It's smarter business for a better world.
Hi, everyone. So consider that the commercial break before our program started. That was a video from our sponsor. And just to be clear, I'm Beena Venkatraman, the Boston Globe's editorial page editor. Our sponsors don't have any influence on the content of our conversations or our event today. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being part of this Earth Week conversation panel on solving the climate crisis. I am thrilled and honored to be able to be in conversation with three leading climate experts and voices, and I think you're going to be thrilled too. So I want to welcome them and just introduce them briefly before we kick off. I also want to let you know that you can use the Q&A function to submit questions during this conversation, and many of you submitted questions already in advance. Because of the volume of the questions and the length of the conversation, we're not going to have a chance to get to all of them, but we'll try to get to as many as we can while still having a flowing conversation and making sure, that we solve the climate crisis in about 60 minutes. So let me welcome Eugenia Gibbons, who is the Massachusetts Climate Director for Healthcare Without Harm. It's a thrill to have Eugenia here. Her career has spanned working on consumer energy policy, consumer energy activism, as well as for the Environmental League of Massachusetts, where she was program director. She led the Global Warming Solutions Project. Now she's working with healthcare institutions and hospitals on both solutions to climate change as well as responses to climate impacts. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Beena.
And I also want to welcome Leah Stokes, who is a policy expert on climate and assistant professor in the political science department and the environmental science department at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the author of this incredible, brilliant book, Short Circuiting Policy, which is really about the state level fights around the country for clean energy and to address the climate crisis. Hey, Leah.
Hi, Beena. That's too generous. Thank you so much. Very kind.
And finally, last but certainly not least, I want to invite Kate Marvel to turn on her video. Kate is a climate research scientist at Columbia University, also with NASA, incredible thinker, one of these scientists who makes you really jealous because she's also a very good writer. So thanks for being here, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to clarify, I am last and I am definitely least in this company.
No way.
We're not going to do.
We're not like to talk some BS on occasion. Yeah.
We're not going to do the humility Olympics here as four women working on climate, thinking about climate change. We're actually, what we're going to do is we're going to blow people's minds. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation. And Kate, I do want to start with you. First and foremost, you think at a really planetary scale about climate change. You, in fact, work on climate models, think about climate, the degree of warming and how those models can actually be improved by looking back at the paleoclimate record, looking deep into history for those who that word doesn't translate for immediately. And I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask a variation of this first part of the question to everyone, just to give you a preview, but sort of how you got into this work of working on the climate crisis, like what brought you to working on climate science, because I know it's not where you started. And then what do you want people to know about what you know about the climate crisis right now?
Great. So I will start with a confession. I am a nerd and I love science. And I did my PhD in cosmology, which is the physics of the entire universe. And I realized midway through my PhD that really this is the only good part of the universe. So I love the Earth. I love studying the Earth. I love finding out new things about the Earth. But right now, we are currently doing an uncontrolled experiment on what is, to my knowledge, the only good planet. And that's something that I think about a lot, and that really worries me.
Can you say more about what specifically you think people ought to know about the science of climate change and sort of where we are on the trajectory of warming?
Sure. So there is a remarkable degree of scientific consensus that greenhouse gases are responsible for warming the planet. I spend my entire career with scientists. We do not agree on anything. And so in order for scientists to all come to a consensus means that the evidence is really, really, really overwhelming. So we know the temperature is rising, and we know exactly what is causing it. And we know exactly where that increased greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. Those are coming from human activities. There is no scientific doubt about this whatsoever. But something people ask me a lot is, okay, well, the global mean temperature is rising. Who cares? I don't experience that. And we care because that is tied into a lot of the things that we do care about. Changes in precipitation patterns, an increased risk of extreme weather events like heat waves and floods and droughts and hurricanes. We also care that the sea levels are rising because a lot of us live in coastal cities that are going to be much more vulnerable to storm surge in the future, among other effects. So where do I see us going? That's kind of a good way to transition into some of the other presenters, because fundamentally, I think where we end up is our choice as human beings. And that's something that's kind of above my pay grade. I study molecules. I don't study people.
You're pretty good with them, though, I will say. Eugenia, I'm hoping you can jump in here because your work really does relate to people, and in particular right now at this phase, human health, and both the impacts of climate change on human health and in communities, and the justice implications of that, which I think are very much on everyone's minds, especially this week, as we struggle with issues of racial justice across the country and really have them acutely felt. And I want to just ask you sort of to tell us how you came to this work. You know, what was the path to engaging on the climate crisis, but also to sort of pick up from where Kate left off and tell us what we need to know about humans and health and what you're working on, both from this point of view of the impacts of climate change, but the solutions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dina. And I'm really pleased to be part of this panel today, so thank you. I actually never thought about myself as getting into climate work. I actually was just very interested in public policy. I was interested in how public policy decisions were driving decisions about energy use and how, what the impacts of those decisions were on people and on community. I'm a very people-focused person. And also, I've just always been intrigued by this disconnect between policy design and actual program implementation, and in a space where we try to design solutions that are going to serve people, if we're not careful, we actually can make things worse for people and for communities. And so that's really kind of the driver for me. It's how I found myself into this, really interested in thinking about energy policy in particular, and how we can really drive innovation to get creative about how we make and use resources, and how we can do that in a way that really lifts up all communities and really makes sure that people's health and their communities and just their well-being is at the center of decision making. I think at this moment, Kate started to speak about this and you touched upon it as well, Bina, the stakes are just so high. I think COVID really reinforced the inextricable link between climate and health and equity and economics and all of these important pieces that contribute to a thriving and healthy community or ecosystem, human ecosystem, not just in the environmental sense. And so it just gets worse from here. we can't deny that our impacts are being felt and that the decisions that we've made have contributed to climate change, and that climate change is having an effect on human health and on every, as was referenced in a recent Scientific America article, every human organ in the human body is affected by climate pollution. And so we know this. As I said, COVID sort of reinforced this as we saw the links between prolonged exposure to particulate matter and the impacts of COVID and the virus itself having disproportionate impacts and even higher rates of death among low-income communities and communities of color and communities that were exposed for a long period of time to pollution. So if we don't do something about it now, if we don't sort of draw the line in the sand today and acknowledge that this is a factor and that this is the only factor and that we need to lead on climate by focusing on people and how we exist in this world and how we exist together, then we just won't solve the climate problem. We can't.
I want to pick up on something you said before we turn and bring Leah into the conversation, which is you said that there's a gap. There's often a gap between the way a policy is designed. So I assume you mean a policy is designed to solve some component of the climate crisis or of energy use or climate impacts, and the way it's actually affecting communities when it gets carried out on the ground. Is there an example of that that comes to mind from your work and your experience where you've really seen that disconnect play out?
Absolutely. I think for a long time, the focus on addressing or on trying to combat climate change has really been on trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Let's figure out what the number is. If we know that we can reduce by that much, then we'll solve climate change. But what's missing from that equation is people actually live in the world. So we can try to model any scenario we want, but we don't live in models and we don't live as numbers. So I think we're beginning to see more and more conversations, and this is certainly being helped and facilitated by the Biden-Harris administration that has really made clear that they're taking a whole government approach to not only climate change, but climate change, environmental justice, climate justice, economic planning. All of these things are linked. And so they're taking a holistic approach to planning, which inherently means people have to be at the center of that. And I think even in Massachusetts, we're really beginning to see, as the state thinks about its own climate planning and its own emissions reduction trajectory, the most recent plans that have come out include consideration of things like impact on human health. I co-chair the Climate Justice Working Group, and so many of our recommendations were around making sure that people are at the center of the equation. And not only are we thinking about what that means, but we're actually working to actively and meaningfully engage people and communities who are on the front lines in the planning, in the design, in the decision making. And the reason why that's so critically important is because A, it restores self-determination to communities that have been so marginalized for so long. But B, we're all well credentialed and did a lot of work to sort of build up our knowledge and our expertise, but there's something to be said and to be valued for lived experience and the expertise that comes with living in the shadow of a polluting facility, or living in a place where you don't have access to reliable transportation or good education systems or good jobs or what have you. Whatever these things are all connected to how we access resources. That is a valuable resource that needs to be brought into the planning. And I think we're seeing that happen more.
That reminds me of the people in New Orleans and even places in coastal Massachusetts who it tends to be sometimes the older people who have these memories of, we know this street floods, like when we had that hurricane back like 40 years ago, we knew that this particular neighborhood was flooding in this way. And that kind of sort of firsthand knowledge can sometimes be a map for the future. So thanks for that. Leah, tell us how you got involved in working on climate policy. I'm going to ask you to kind of take us to the national level. We've looked at Massachusetts and a bit at the planet, but we know that Joe Biden is planning to make this announcement tomorrow around setting a target of cutting our emissions by half by 2030, that there are already these goals at the national level around decarbonizing the electricity sector, which you are an expert on. So after you tell us how you got into this work, why you got into it, tell us what you think is realistic? Are we gonna be able to do this?
Well, yes, I just want to start by saying thanks so much. I did my PhD in Cambridge, and so I'm a big fan of the Boston Globe, and I've been so lucky to be able to write, and Bina's such an amazing editor there and has really increased the climate coverage in the paper. So huge shout out to Bina. And I also want to echo something Eugenia was saying. You know, there's amazing new research coming out from, for example, the Census Bureau, which shows that pollution, things like particulate matter, all these conventional air pollutants, sulfur, mercury, nitrous oxides, they actually have not just effects in the first generation, you know, the people who are breathing it in, not just effects in the second generation, their children, but actually effects in the third generation, which means that air pollution, which is overwhelmingly put into Black and brown bodies in this country, is having an effect at least 2 generations down the line. And so the choices that we make today about where we're putting polluting infrastructure, how we're transforming our electricity system, have real impacts on people's lives and their children's lives and their children's children's lives. And so we really do have to center pollution and people on the front lines, including primarily Black Americans, which leads to the effect of Black children having asthma rates 2 times as high as white children. And so I think that there's been a really big reckoning both in the climate movement and also in the policymaking arena, as Eugenia has been talking about, that, you know, it's not just about carbon pollution. It's not just about abstract numbers. It's about people, and it's often about people of color who are on the front lines of pollution. In terms of how I got into this, I'm originally from Canada, and I was always just passionate about the environment. I was one of those 90s kids recycling and doing all that fun stuff. And I actually wrote about my origin story in this cool book called All We Can Save, which is a collection of writings from 60 women all across the climate movement, very diverse. Kate is in it too. It's a really cool collection. And so I tell the origin story there of being somebody who cared about, you know, the planet, climate, pandas, things like that. That eventually got me into energy, because the energy system is actually that place where all of these problems start, right? The fact that we burn fossil fuels, the fact that we have all these polluting infrastructure that's not just, of course, causing climate change, but also causing huge impacts on communities, particularly communities of color. You know, that's really the crux of the issue. So for some reason, I went to MIT and studied electricity, which is a very boring subject, I suppose, but extremely important, because as I've come to realize in the course of writing this book, Short Circuiting Policy, and also just working in advocacy and research, is that if we can clean up the electricity system, not only can we solve a lot of these health problems that we're talking about, but we can actually do a huge dent on our carbon problems. So, you know, if we clean up the electricity system, that's about 28% of current emissions. Then what can we do? We can use clean electricity to electrify transportation, which is like 29% of current emissions. We can also use it to do buildings, which is 11% of current emissions. We can do half of heavy industry, which is, I think, 22%. Anyway, you add up all those numbers and these things I'm telling you, you get to 75% of economy-wide carbon pollution, which of course is highly correlated with all the other conventional air pollutants we're talking about. So if we can clean up the electricity system and electrify buildings, transportation, parts of heavy industry, we can get a huge way down the line. And so where this is currently being discussed is in 2 places federally. One is, of course, in the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution. For folks who follow this stuff, there's this big international process. It's called Paris, the Paris Agreement. And what countries have to do is they have to say, here's what I'm going to do. It's kind of like planning or commitments or goal setting. You know, I'm going to go exercise 3 times a week, but for countries on climate change. And it's like, I am going to cut emissions. We think this is what the Biden administration is going to say tomorrow, I believe. I'm going to cut emissions for the US economy-wide 50% from 2005 levels, which is the baseline year, by 2030. Okay, what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of scientists, has told us is that we have to cut emissions globally by 45% by 2030 to limit warming to that 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is, you know, what we're trying for theoretically under Paris. So the US contribution to that global effort would be 50% cut. So that's what we're expecting to see. And where does clean electricity fit into that? Well, folks might have noticed that on March 31st, President Biden announced the American Jobs Plan. That's a plan that would go through Congress, which would address climate, jobs, air pollution, lots of different stuff. And one of the really key things in it is a clean electricity standard. A clean electricity standard is a policy that requires us to clean up our electricity system. And Biden has been very vocal that he wants to do that by 2035. He wants 100% clean electricity by 2035. And so what Congress can do, if this is done through what's called the budget reconciliation process, which is basically the way that we can pass legislation if Republicans refuse to cooperate, which so far is looking like what's happening. And that requires 50 votes plus one, Vice President Kamala Harris. And that means that it has to be budgetary. And a clean electricity standard can fit within that process. And what we could do is say by 2030, so that same timeline as the nationally determined contribution for Paris, by 2030, we're going to cut emissions by 80%. And me and some friends have been doing a little fun math, because that's what we do for fun. And we figured out that that's about half of the NDC target. So if we're trying to cut emissions by 50% by 2030, cleaning up the electricity system, getting to 80% clean, getting this clean electricity standard passed gets us halfway pretty much to that overall 50% cut. So that's what's on the agenda federally. This is really big stakes, and it's not just going to cut carbon pollution by 86% by 2030. It's going to cut sulfur dioxide by 93%. It's going to cut nitrous oxides by 76%. I wish I had the number for mercury and particulate matter, but this is a really, really big thing, and it's something that there's a lot of momentum around.
So I was just going to ask you that. I mean, obviously, if it goes through budget reconciliation, we're not talking about a large majority. We're just talking about a simple majority in the Senate. But is there support for doing this at the kind of level that you think will trigger the right amount of change in the electricity sector on the right timescale?
Well, every day I try to increase that support. That's like my full-time gig right now. I'm very passionate about the clean electricity standard. And, I think we're going to see more and more support. There's going to be a letter coming out next week from across the environmental movement. I don't want to scoop that, but let's just say it's broad. It has big green organizations. It's got EJ. It has regional and local groups. We are seeing support from that grassroots for this approach. Last week on Friday, a group of more than 10 electric utilities, which would be the regulated entities that we'd have to get to do these things. The companies like Exelon, Talent Energy, Holy Cross, all these companies across the country, LADWP, they said, we are willing to cut 80% emissions by 2030. So we're starting to see the utility industry. We're starting to see the movement. We're starting to see congressional leadership talking about this. We just saw Secretary Granholm at the Department of Energy say, I think we can do a CES, and I think we can do it through budget reconciliation. So one of the key things we got to keep is that ambition that President Biden has put on the table. He has said 100% by 2035. We're at 40% clean right now. So I love how I'm just like talking in math and numbers all the time. I'm really representing MIT right now. We're at 40% right now. So if we want to get to 100% by 2035, the straight line is you got to get 80 by 2030. So we have to hold strong to this 80 by 2030 number, because a budget reconciliation process only gives you a 10-year window to work it through. So we can't probably get that 2035, but we got to hold strong to that 80% number. And if we can get 80% clean by 2030, we'll be in a really amazing position. And another cool thing that's happened is not only did Los Angeles Department of Water Power, LADWP, sign that letter, they also came out with a plan for their whole utility to be 100% clean by 2035. So we're starting to see momentum from the climate movement, from the utility sector, from Congress, from the executive branch through the White House to say, and through the Department of Energy to say, you know what? We can do this. And this will be a huge contribution to our plan for cutting emissions globally.
So I want to pick up on this, and Eugenia, I want you to chime in on this as well, having worked on energy at the state level. In places like Massachusetts is part of a regional initiative to set these kinds of standards for reducing emissions from the electricity sector. We were the first region in the country to do this. So we're already sort of on the road to doing this. But how does this affect how does this actually have a big delta, right? Like, how does it actually have a huge impact is the part I want to ask you, Leah. What is the implication for it in red states? What's the implication for it in states like Texas, where we just saw a total meltdown of the grid in February?
Natural gas, fossil fuels cause that problem, but yes.
Well, yes, I want you to clarify that, because I think there's been a rumor. I don't know how. Maybe the governor of Texas said that it was renewable energy, but so I would love for you to just shed some light on that. But Eugenia, from your perspective, I want to know, what is the implication of a national standard being set versus states taking this on their own? What are your thoughts about how this actually plays out for communities?
Sure. I think two things that Leah mentioned that I just think are so important right now is we have ambition and we have momentum, and we have to really capitalize on both of those things. I think we're fortunate to live in a state where we've had that mentality for some time. We can always do more. We can have much higher, much greater ambition in terms of what we're pursuing. But I think, to your point, Veena, it's not enough for individual states to act alone. So if it's important for individual states to lead by example, to move other states along. And I think for a long time, states like California, Massachusetts, New York have played that role. Pardon me. But now to have that leadership coming from the federal government, and to have a true partner on climate action in DC is a whole new, ball of wax. It's a game changer, because it means that there's no longer a patchwork of policies that kind of are moving the needle slightly here or there. It means that we're setting a standard and we're saying, this is what we're doing. This is the position we are taking as a nation. We are acknowledging that we are a primary contributor to the climate crisis globally. And we are doing what we can to A, make up for lost ground, and B, try to put ourselves on track to have a positive impact going forward, because it is going to fall to the major polluting nations to do that. We can't rely on those who have not contributed to the problem as much to solve the problem. And that is kind of the crux of the justice question, big picture and small picture. But I think that's where we are right now. So it does not mean that states that are making progress will lose ground. It actually means that states that are making progress and have worked towards progress for a long time are in line to continue that, and arguably move even faster because of federal leadership.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in on this, Veena. I couldn't agree with Eugenia more. This is about accelerating progress here. A federal target of 80% clean power by 2030 would be pretty much more ambitious than everywhere else. And so it would accelerate the trajectory across the country, including in places like Massachusetts. And, that if we go through the budget reconciliation process, if you want to get really into the weeds of things that I didn't even know a year ago, the Byrd rule basically says, if you want to do budget reconciliation, it's got to be spending or revenue oriented, which means that this can be an investment oriented approach. It means that the federal government can be a partner with states, with utilities, say, hey, you're going to make these changes. You're going to shut down dirty coal plants. You're going to build new renewables, and we're going to help you do that financially, so that these costs of a really rapid transition are not going onto ratepayers. Because another part of the justice conversation has to be about affordability, right? We are dealing right now in the pandemic with a huge problem of arrears on electricity bills, particularly for Black Americans. There is over $40 billion of money that everyday people owe to their utility company, because during the pandemic, a lot of people have lost their jobs. They are behind. And, for communities of color, for poor people, the energy burden, meaning how much of their money is spent on energy, is really high. Like for wealthy people, many people potentially tuning in, you pay your electricity bill, maybe you don't think very much about it. But for poor people in this country, the electricity bill is a huge part of your monthly budget. And when you've lost your job and you're dealing with an economic crisis, it's hard to pay it. And so we have to make sure that as we clean up the electricity system, we keep the electricity system affordable so that everybody can pay their bills. And so that as we electrify transportation and buildings, you're using more and more electricity to do everything in your life, that electricity is affordable so that it can be done, we can be used for everything that you need. So, that's got to be the vision here. And if the federal government steps up with an investment-oriented approach, which is really what President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have been so focused on, they're not going to just, put a price on carbon, use a market-based initiative and say, let's hope it all works out. They're saying, let's use standards, let's use investments, let's drive this and let's make sure we deliver on justice. And that standards, investment, and justice approach, I think, is exactly the right way to go forward. And it really will make it easier for states, for cities, for everyday people to make this transition happen.
If I could just add one comment, Dina.
Sure.
The standards, the investments, the transition, that's all important too. And I think the other thing is really finally valuing the health benefits associated with this transition, because that is a separate cost that is right now not factored into the decisions that we make about energy, but it should be. And I think that going forward, one of the things that excites me most is that there is a real opportunity to not look strictly at the capital investment side of the ledger, but to also look at all of the benefits that come with making those investments. And when you start to stack up things like the ability to contain healthcare costs, the ability to reduce number of health incidents, or to reduce asthma occurrences, all of these things that cost people days at work, days at school, that are having an economic impact, when you add those up and how we can improve those through clean energy investments, then it tips the scales even further in favor of being ambitious and maintaining momentum to try to drive change faster.
It makes me think we've got to get the Congressional Budget Office to do more about counting the impact of averting catastrophe. It's really a great point. Kate, I want to ask you about this because, okay, so this is a kind of rosy picture of what the Biden administration is doing, even of what Massachusetts is doing with its recent historic climate legislation. But all of these policies and even the targets at the global level in Paris, we know, are sort of tied to an understanding of planetary change, which is tied to these global climate models that you and others have worked on. It's tied to our understanding of how fast the ice sheets are melting, how fast the seas might rise. What kind of assumptions are fair to make? What kind of surprises have we seen that might actually end up changing some of these assumptions around what we need to do and what's far enough and fast enough?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I think needs to be made very clear is that there is no safe level of climate change, and we cannot prevent climate change. It's already here. We have seen and really rigorously attributed many of the observed changes to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and other human activities. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. Even if we manage to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, that does not mean that we are safe. We are still going to see, for example, 70% of coral reef loss, as opposed to 99 or 90% if we see 2 degrees of warming. So the more we can limit warming, the better off we'll be. But I think the conversation is sometimes, well, do we need adaptation or do we need mitigation? And the answer is we need both. In terms of nasty surprises that could be lying in wait for us in the future, I think it's really important to differentiate between different flavors of nasty surprise. So sometimes people talk about runaway greenhouse effects and tipping points and feedbacks as though they're all the same thing. And I think that sort of confuses some very distinct concepts. So a runaway greenhouse effect, are we going to somehow trigger a reaction that boils off the oceans and turns the Earth into Venus? No, there's no evidence for that in the paleoclimate record. There's no evidence for that theoretically. That's probably not going to happen. So that's basically the only good news on the physics front that I have for you right now. Positive feedbacks is possibly the worst term that scientists have, because when normal people hear positive feedback, they think I'm doing a great job. And when scientists say positive feedback, we mean destabilizing physical process that is making global warming worse. So an example of a positive feedback is what we call the ice albedo feedback. Basically the fact that ice is super shiny. It's really good at reflecting sunlight that would otherwise warm up the planet's surface. If you make it warmer, you melt that ice. You don't have that reflective cover anymore. You've got much darker ground or water underneath. And so melting the ice speeds up that warming. It makes it worse. So that is an example of a positive feedback. And it's not just one that we expect to happen in the future. It's one that is already happening right now. So I spend a lot of my time and a lot of my career looking at these feedbacks and looking at, are they going to get worse in the future? What can we tell about climate? What can climate change right now tell us about feedbacks in the future? Then there is the concept of a tipping point, which is a threshold that you cross where you can't go back. So an example of a tipping point is the disintegration of the ice sheets in Antarctica or Greenland. Those are not things that you can restore overnight if you take carbon dioxide out of the air, for example. Those are really irreversible and destructive changes to the Earth system. And this is where uncertainty is very much not our friend. I talk a lot about uncertainty because I'm a scientist. I love uncertainty. I love finding out new things. I don't want to just talk about stuff that we've known since 1896, right? Which is carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That's boring. I don't want to talk about it. I want to talk about uncertainty. But uncertainty doesn't mean that we don't know anything. We know a lot. Unfortunately, we can't put really precise thresholds. We can't say if we limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, we will avoid these tipping points. And that's because we have never done this experiment on this planet before. We don't have a perfect historical analog for this. And there is a lot in this incredibly complex interconnected system that we don't understand. And so we can't say we can warm up to a particular threshold and everything will be okay. And beyond that threshold, everything is terrible. That doesn't exist. There is a lot of uncertainty in when we'll hit those tipping points. The only certain thing is that we know it's warming, we know why, and we know that there are a lot of nasty things lying in wait for us if we don't get it under control.
So Kate, I have to ask you this, and it relates to one of the audience questions. No one's reading anything in this particular instance. I'm so used to thinking of audiences as readers in my current role. But this notion that there could be, some thresholds, some tipping points, and/or positive feedback, which is really negative, has been used to sort of advocate for some of the sort of measures that fall under the category of geoengineering, like putting sulfate particles into the atmosphere to create some more of that albedo effect, to reflect solar radiation away from the planet. What do you make of some of those solutions and the degree to which either research on them or testing of them should be in the arsenal of tools used to address the climate crisis?
Yeah, so thank you for giving me this opportunity to complain at great length about geoengineering. I support model-based research into geoengineering because you can do unspeakable things to the climate within a computer model. That is interesting, that teaches you things. You can not only spray sulfate in the stratosphere, you can set off volcanoes whenever you want. You can make whole continents vanish. You can do things that nobody would ever do in the real world. And so I think doing geoengineering experiments within a climate model is useful because it teaches us a lot about how the planet responds. And we are pretty sure that it would be possible to lower the global average temperature by, for example, spraying sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, because that would block the sun. If you have less sunlight, the temperature rises less. However, we care about a lot besides the global average temperature. We care about things like precipitation patterns. We care about drought. We care about the hydrological cycle. And a lot of things like sunlight. Plants like sunlight. People that eat plants like sunlight. I like sunlight. And so the global climate system is not something extremely simple that we can just monkey with and we can cancel out exactly. We can't cancel out our carbon dioxide emissions by blocking sunlight. It just doesn't work that way. And that's before you even get into the extremely thorny questions of governance, of attribution, of the fact that this is surprisingly easy. It's surprisingly cheap. A billionaire with a couple private jets could probably do something like this. What are the implications of that? What are the implications of the lack of a global structure to make these decisions? And if this happens, if a single actor or country decides to do this, there is a lot of internal variability in the climate system. The climate is changing in response to greenhouse gas emissions as well. So if a certain country decides to proceed with solar radiation management, with geoengineering, and a natural disaster happens in another country, if there is that ambiguity, if there is that uncertainty, does it really matter? Does it matter if you can't scientifically or robustly statistically attribute an extreme weather event to that geoengineering if the perception is there? And so those are really, really useful things to think about as well. And I think, I'm going to be a total broken record about this, but climate change is not just a scientific issue. In fact, it's not primarily a scientific issue. Leah and Eugenia have made it very, very clear that climate change is a social issue. It is an issue about people. And as a scientist, please don't make us solve this problem on our own. We solve differential equations. We do not solve massive social problems.
Well said. I feel like giving you positive feedback for that response, but I'm just gonna I want to get into the audience questions, and we'll get this right before we end here. So if you have a burning question, please put it into the Q&A, and we will do our best to triage it with the other questions, the many other questions that have been submitted in advance, and a few of them today. And this one, Eugenia, I just feel is important, and I think it's one for you to take. And it's a question about Massachusetts. And it says, for those of us in South coastal communities and on the Cape, what actions are being taken by the state government to mitigate the impacts of climate change? And I would say, mitigate is sort of the word we tend to use around emissions, but I think what they're asking about is protecting these communities from the impacts of climate change. And I would just add a little asterisk extra part to that question and ask you if you think it's enough.
Wow. Well, first, let me just also say I like sun too, Kate. I think the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, is doing a lot to help communities mitigate risk associated with climate change, supporting risk assessments, supporting efforts to understand what is the potential impact of an extreme storm, or what are the things we need to be aware of and be preparing for. I think as a whole, the Commonwealth is also taking very seriously a desire to pursue ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The Baker administration just spent, almost 2 years planning and modeling and trying to determine what is a good path, what is a feasible path to decarbonization by 2050. They're finalizing their draft proposal for how to achieve emission reductions by 2030, 50% below 1990 levels by 2030 per the most recent, the climate law that was just enacted. And so I think there's a lot of planning underway, but quite frankly, Dina, I think that we, like many states, are in a place where resources are limited. I think that we are in a situation nationally, globally, really, where we know what we have to do to combat climate change. We know what sorts of investments need to be made, and yet we're still competing against the things that are making our planet sick, or the things that are making our communities sick when it comes to dollars and resources and how to direct those. So the first answer is, yes, I do think the state is thinking about, or agencies within the state are thinking about what climate looks like and the impacts look like from the coast to Western Mass. There are programs in place to help do some planning and thinking about it. But there's still a lot that's going to fall to private sector, or to individual actors, to sector representatives, to the healthcare sector, for example. One of the things that we're constantly thinking about is, what is our role in contributing to community resilience and climate smart healthcare? And what does that look like? What does it mean? How do we support that? And then I think the opportunity to do more is to both direct investment in a strategic and targeted way and work towards ensuring we have a budget that reflects the level of commitment that we have. If a budget, for example, is a statement of values and things that we are prioritizing, then our state budgets and our program budgets need to reflect this deep and abiding commitment to reducing emissions as a Commonwealth and to leading by example. And then the other piece of that is, I think that we are in a moment, as I said earlier, where we really need to be convening conversations that start with frontline communities and are led by individuals who are living the current effects of climate change, and not only engage them meaningfully in a conversation, but put them in the driver's seat to really help dictate, what does the path forward look like? What does it mean for a community on the front lines to be less vulnerable to climate, or to be more resilient? And so I think those are the two things that we could really do better as a Commonwealth, but also just everywhere. Think about how we're using dollars, really invest substantially, and then also allow people who are living this experience and who have been marginalized for so long to really sort of guide the process going forward. I think we need to see that in the states. We're obviously seeing that as a commitment coming from the Biden-Harris administration.
Thanks. This one I think is for Leah, and it's a good question. So I wanted to make sure we got to this. And it does relate to how you talked about what the Biden administration was doing around investment, but I think it's a little more specific. This person is asking how to engage the financial, manufacturing, and academic sectors to jumpstart the next phase in the clean energy renaissance and reach 100% carbon-free future. So financial, manufacturing, and academic sectors, how do we jumpstart them?
Sure, happy to take that. And I also want to go back to a really good point that Eugenia made a couple minutes ago. When she was talking about how the health benefits can really pay for a lot of this transition. Recently, an economist gave testimony to Congress and was asked a question like, do you think that the costs of this bill will be greater than the benefits of the climate, that we'll get from climate benefits? And he was like, maybe not. I just thought that was such an ignorant response because, well, what about the health benefits? What about the benefits of particulate matter, mercury? What we've seen across the board is that we can pay for climate action through health benefits alone because the health costs are massive. And actually I learned a lot of this when I was at MIT because I was in an atmospheric chemistry lab and working with somebody who was estimating health costs for mercury, Dr. Noel Salin. And so, the health costs are massive and we really can't forget about that. In terms of how do we engage folks to get to this 100% by 2035 goal? I think that that's beginning to happen. There's been really fantastic research in terms of the academy coming out of Berkeley, the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. There's a group that put out an amazing report last summer you can just go to 2035report.com. You can download it and it talks about all the benefits of transitioning to, in this case, 90% clean by 2035, how much it would potentially reduce bill costs for electricity consumers, all the health impacts and benefits, all the benefits to the electricity system. We know that this is doable because of some of the research coming out of the academy. In terms of how do we get finance on board with this, I think that it's becoming increasingly clear that we are potentially facing a carbon bubble in financial investment. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you keep putting money into things like old coal plants, which is what happened around 2010 when the Mercury Rule came out, or you keep it building new gas plants, which is what tons of utilities are currently planning to do. And if you're interested in looking at that, I wrote a report in February, or maybe it was January, with the Sierra Club. If you just Google the dirty truth about utilities climate pledges, you can check out this dashboard where we look at all these utilities across the country and what are they actually planning to do. And they're planning to build a lot of gas. Now, what happens if these utilities build a lot of gas and then we say we're getting to 80% clean by 2030, 100% clean by 2035? That's called a stranded cost or a stranded asset. And that creates really big problems in the financial sector because folks have lent money to these companies and those companies have made really bad investment decisions. They've invested in projects that aren't going to pay themselves back over the time period that we have. And so I think that, unfortunately, our financial sector has been very symbiotic with the fossil fuel industry for a very long time. There's a new report out by Desmog Blog and I think the Sunrise Project, which looks at all the bank boards and how many people on bank boards are tied to the fossil fuel industry. There was a lot of discussion around this with Chase Bank because they had a former, I think, Exxon person on their board for a long time. But, it's not just Chase. I mean, Chase should be criticized, but a lot of banks are putting people on the board of directors and who are very tied to the fossil fuel industry. So there's a whole campaign, if people are interested in this, it's called Stop the Money Pipeline. You can go to stopthemoneypipeline.com, I think, or .org and look this up. And so the financial sector is something that we are going to have to see. And it's been interesting with the Biden-Harris administration because we're starting to see things from folks like Janet Yellen saying, maybe we got to look at climate risk. And climate risk is not just what's going to happen to our infrastructure. It's what's going to happen to our financial sector if our financial sector is completely embedded within the fossil fuel economy, and then the fossil fuel economy starts to go south, which is what's already been happening during the pandemic. So, I think that there are movements across different sectors of our economy towards this 100% target. And we need everybody moving in this direction because we need investments, we need research, we need everything to make it clear about how are we going to get that 100% by 2035 goal met.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask this question of Kate because you wrote a Scientific American essay that I think speaks to how you think about this, which, is different than how I think about it, maybe, which is the question is really, given the magnitude of the problem, how can one be optimistic about the probability of seeing positive corrections to climate change within the next 50 years?
So I have a strange relationship to optimism and hope. And my personal contention is that we don't need optimism or hope because we know exactly what to do. So for me, the clarity of the problem scientifically really helps inform the actions that we need to take socially and politically. This is not an asteroid. This is not an unknown problem. We know exactly why the temperature is rising, and we understand a lot of the implications of that. We know that the temperature is rising because humans, not all humans and not equally, are putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And we should stop doing that. So that to me is very clarifying to think about it. I work with climate models and I do a lot of these future projections of what climate change could mean. And the thing that really, really stands out to me is how optional so much of this destruction is. We don't have to live in the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is fairly horrifying. Wildfires, droughts, heat waves, potential increases in what we call the wet bulb temperature, which is a combination of heat and humidity that will make areas of the tropics uninhabitable or very, very dangerous for humans to be outside in. So those are horrifying, but those are also optional because we know exactly on a scientific basis what is driving those. We know how to stop them and we know how to avoid that worst case scenario. I would end by saying that how I increase carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases in a climate model is I go into a run deck and I change a number and I type the new number in. That is not how carbon dioxide concentrations increase in the real world. That's ignoring the history, that's ignoring the social structures, that's ignoring the politics. And so I don't want to minimize the challenges that we have ahead. But in terms of the science says that the worst case scenario is completely optional.
Thanks for that. Okay, here's one that I think, actually, I want to ask one of Leah before I ask this final one of everyone, which came from an audience member. And this one also came in the audience, and it has to do with what electricity, the question is about what electricity sources should back up wind and solar.
Fun. Okay. So when I've been talking about 80% clean, I've been talking about that not just because of the budget reconciliation rules, but also because we know that's doable. The 2035 report modeled 90%. Where things start to get tricky is when we get to that last 10 to 20% of the grid. As we get to these higher and higher levels of wind and solar, these are called intermittent resources, meaning the sun is not shining all the time, the wind is not blowing all the time. And so we have to think about how are we going to balance the system. There's a couple important variables to doing that. One is transmission lines. So we have to build a system of high voltage DC transmission lines, a backbone across the country. It's going to be hard, but it's something that the Biden-Harris administration is focused on.
Well, yes, one audience member expressed skepticism about whether we can get 50 states to agree and coordinate on anything, given how we've seen them handle COVID in such different ways. Yeah. So I do feel like it's important to acknowledge that audience member might be skeptical about this. And
yeah, these high voltage DC transmission lines are horrible. You can read this cool book, Superpower by Russell Gold, and learn about the hard story of one guy trying to build one transmission line. And in the end of the story is it didn't work. And so another piece is batteries. If we have battery backup, that's a storage thing. Then we're going to have to figure out how we're going to balance the last piece. It's possible that we could have natural gas plants that don't operate very frequently. Obviously, that's not a great thing because that's a fossil fuel. It's possible that there could be other sources. Some people talk about hydrogen, or it's possible we'll have breakthrough technologies that we don't know yet. And, this is something that, for example, Bill Gates, who I don't always agree with, talks a lot about if you read his book, How to Avoid Climate Disaster, because he's really fixated on these last really tricky parts. What I'm really fixated is on how do we get from 40% today to 80% by 2030. That's my goal. Okay, the last chunk's hard. Well, guess what? The Biden-Harris administration wants to put $180 billion into that problem. So we can make, we can walk and chew gum. We can make a huge amount of progress right now with the technologies we have that we know work and figure out that last chunk as we go.
Okay.
And if I could just add to that, Leah, this is so important when it comes to this question. We don't have to solve 2050 today. We have to get to 2030. We have to put ourselves on a trajectory to meet 2050. And we might not have all the answers, but one thing we know for certain is we will not get there if we continue to move down the path of A, the path of least resistance, and B, maintain the status quo. So.
All right, so I want rapid fire because we're right at the end of the time. Rapid fire answers to this question, which I want to commend the questioner because almost every climate panel I have moderated and been on, and this among us, it's probably 1,000 or more in this group. People ask, what can I do as an individual? And this person asked at a very different unit. This person said, how can we make the most difference beginning in our own neighborhood? And I thought that was such a great way of thinking of it. So I want to just ask everyone to give their quick thought on that as we
go first. I generally think that political action is number one. This is actually the point of my essay and All We Can Save. But if you really want to do one thing, electrify your home. Look into electrifying your home. Get fossil gas out of your home. Talk to your neighbors about it. This is something we have to do in every building across the country. And, everybody's talking solar panels, EVs. Electrify your home.
I would actually start with weatherize your home. We have a nation-leading energy efficiency program. So first start with, if you haven't, made your home more efficient, start there. And then yes, electrify your home. I want to echo, engage locally. Everybody always thinks that the sexiest path to change is through the State House or through DC. It's not. It's probably through your city hall or your conservation commission or your city council or places where really local decisions that have a really big impact are happening. So plug in, pardon the pun, plug in there.
We need bumper stickers that say City Hall is sexy. I'm feeling Kim Janey would like that. All right, Kate.
Don't vote for people who don't get it and organize for people who do.
Very succinct. Thank you. What a brilliant group of people. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us. And I'm sure all the people who've tuned in and who will tune into the recording after are grateful to you too. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the entire audience for joining us today.